The following is a message from Christ Central Manchester, a church that meets in the heart of Manchester in the UK. To find out more about us, please visit www.christcentral.org.uk.
So, as I said, this morning we're asking another one of these big questions. We basically put this series together. There was a few of us involved in thinking through what that would look like. And the two main aims really for this series are, one is to help equip us as Christians and to inform us so that when we are talking to people that maybe wouldn't follow Jesus or think that they're religious at all and they're wondering what Christians think about these big topics, that we'd have something to say. So really the first aim is to inform us. The second aim is perhaps there might even be people that you can invite to these particular Sundays that we've been putting on, and therefore it might be helpful for them to come along and hear it, or even after the event to listen to it online or watch it online as it will go on this week. And we've looked already at the two big questions of what does God think about sex, which was earlier on this year. Then more recently we looked at the question of if God exists, how can there be suffering? We looked at the whole big question of suffering in the world. This morning we're asking the question, what does God or what does the Bible say about the refugee crisis that we've currently got, which ties in so well with what Andy was talking about with Jubilee Plus and all that they're trying to promote and support and help with across the UK. We're going to be looking at the refugee crisis this morning. And in the autumn, final kind of big question this year is going to be, has science buried God? And Adrian Holloway, a friend of ours and who's brilliant in these kind of questions, is going to be here speaking. And so there's that to look forward to as well. But today we're looking at the refugee crisis. And our main 3 points are, number one, we're going to look at the recent history that's led up to the crisis that we're currently in. So a bit more informational. Secondly, we're going to then look at, very briefly, the different responses that there might be in the UK, but could be in most societies, to refugees coming in to a country. And then thirdly, we're going to look at what God thinks. We're going to look at the Bible and the Bible response to refugees and foreigners, as it often calls it. And we're going to get into some interesting stuff this morning. And I'm hoping in many ways that I'm speaking to the choir, as it were, when it comes to what the Bible says about refugees. But there will be something in us sometimes that becomes unbiblical, becomes ungodly, when we're surrounded by so many different voices that are not biblical or godly, and we can find ourselves wavering into different trains of thought that I would argue are unhelpful and just perpetuate some of the fear and scaremongering that there is going around. So just to give you a little bit of a flavour of where we're going. By way of introduction still, I just want to go through a list of terms or words that we're going to be using, because I think it's helpful. There's so many different words used and they can have varying definitions, and I think for us this morning it's just helpful just to pinpoint what I'm going to be meaning when I say the word migrant or when I say the word refugee. It's going to be helpful just to do that, because you may have a different meaning. So if you can just go with my meanings for this morning, that would be helpful. I know recently, or in recent months, the BBC put out this statement that you see on a lot of their websites or pages to do with this whole topic. They want to make sure that they're clearly understood as to what they mean when they say different words. But let's just go through some of these words just to be clear what we're talking about this morning. First of all, the word migrant, we're going to use it in the more kind of literal, old-fashioned. It has had now a negative connotation to it. It can now mean that we don't trust that these people are moving for the right reasons. I don't want that meaning for it right now this morning. I just want to go back to the traditional definition that you might get in the dictionary, which is it's somebody who moves. A migrant is somebody who moves. So that's just who moves location. Within that kind of umbrella, we've then got forced migrants, people who move location because they haven't got a choice. They don't want to leave their home. Most people don't want to leave their home, but they have been forced to. Within that, so if we've got umbrella to subcategory, we've got internally displaced. Internally displaced. And there's 38 million apparently in the world at the moment, people who are internally displaced. And that means that they have been forced to move home, but not forced to move country. So they're still within the borders of their country, but they've moved from their town or their village or their city. And they've moved. And then if you cross a national border, you're still a forced migrant, but you're not internally displaced, you're a refugee. Okay, so this is where we're going with these terms this morning. And apparently in the world at the moment, approximately, these are more approximate, these figures, we'll have some more detailed figures later on, but the number for refugees in the world at the moment is well over 20 million. So 38 million internally displaced, 20 million refugees who have crossed the borders. That adds up to at least 58 million people at the moment in the world are not at home because they've been forced out of their home and out of their town. Some of this will be statistics, but I want to keep coming back to the fact that this is real people, not just 58 million number, 58 million people who wouldn't want to leave but have had to leave their home. When we tweeted this week that we were talking about this morning, I got an immediate, I've never had such a quick kind of retweet, I think it was, that just changed it from, we were saying when we were talking about a refugee crisis, there is a Twitter account that is called The Human Crisis. And it's like they pick up, whenever they hear the phrase refugee crisis, they pick it up and they change it to human crisis and retweet it. And I kind of appreciated it. I think it's on the right, it's kind of where we want to be going this morning. This isn't just migrants. This isn't even just refugees. This is human beings. So I want us to be very clear where we're going this morning. So that's refugee, somebody who moves across a border. The 1951 Geneva Convention, after World War II, set up or defined refugee as somebody who's fleeing persecution, and it can include any form of danger, war in your home country, but other dangers as well. Within the 20 million refugees, or at least 20 million refugees, within that number there are asylum seekers, at least 2 million of them, who have applied for asylum. Just to define the word asylum, the phrase asylum seeker, we mean somebody who has applied for asylum, applied for to be allowed to stay in the country that they found themselves in. And there are, what did I just say? There are well over 2 million of those at the moment. If they are granted asylum, they can never be, I don't think they can ever be asked to go back once you've been granted that asylum. Then, just coming back to that top umbrella word migrant, under the kind of term migration, there is this thing of voluntary migration, and the most common category within that is economic migration. People who choose to move for a better job or a better standard of living. There can also be environmental migration, so maybe there was a poor harvest in your country, or maybe there was a natural disaster, but then you begin to get where this thing gets complicated. You get the blurred line between somebody who is classed as an environmental migrant and somebody who is now a refugee. You understand where I'm going with this? Because if it's a severe famine to the point where you can no longer feed yourself or your family, surely you're a forced migrant. And then if you move over a border, you're a refugee. You're no longer an economic migrant. So even within some of these terms, there's blurriness, and we've got to be aware of that. And hopefully what some of I'm trying to communicate this morning is this thing is not simple. And we mustn't think we can box this thing up. The same way we couldn't box up the whole suffering question, we can't necessarily box this one up. If there's a war in your country, but you're not directly impacted, i.e. your town has not been blown up, so there is, in a sense, there's relative safety in your town, but the company that you work for no longer exists or can't exist in the same way and therefore can't employ you, and you've therefore been forced to move, are you still an economic migrant? I would argue probably not. Maybe there's another phrase which I've heard, impelled migrant. This is how confusing this whole thing can be. We're not going to be using that phrase this morning. We're not really going to be using the word migrant much this morning because our focus is going to be on the refugee crisis. This is not. This is going to touch on some of the EU issues, and obviously we've got this big referendum coming up very soon. We could talk about that this morning, but we'd be here for a long time. Could I just say, though, that if you are still undecided about the EU referendum, could I just urge you to put even economic migrants and the refugee crisis, first of all, into two different boxes, but then to put both those boxes on a long list of, if you're going to do any sort of research, or if you're going to do any thinking on this before you come to an informed decision as a Christian as to what you do in the referendum, can I just urge you to think that this is one category of many in the whole debate about the referendum. That as Christians, we're not going to go and cherry pick one or two or be obsessed with one or two areas to decide what we're going to do. I would argue there is at least a dozen different categories to think through. I bought a book. If you want to know what it is, I can tell you at the end. It was, I can't remember the name at the moment. But I bought a book and just researched all the different categories. You don't need to do that. You can just go online and research the different categories that there are. But there are numerous categories that help inform what we do. And I basically scored on all the categories whether I would vote in or out based on that category alone and all the kind of different debates in that particular category. It's a bit time consuming, but if you want to make sure you feel informed as you tick that box, cross that box even, you want to feel informed, then I would urge you to do that. And just to see that the refugee crisis is a very small box, I would argue, on the long list, because whether we're in or out of the EU, we have a responsibility to refugees. And the economic migrant topic, which is another box, the EU economic migrant topic, I would argue is one of a long list of categories that we need to be thinking about. So that's all I'm going to say about the EU situation in terms of the referendum. I just thought I'd touch on it quickly. So that we've hopefully defined some of the terms and we can press on. First of all, this morning, just want to explain some of the recent history which has led up to where we are right now and where we are as a country, the UK, where we are as a continent, where we are also in terms of the actual crisis, particularly in Syria. The last 100 years have seen a lot of migration. Remember when we said migration, it just means movement of people. But also mass numbers of refugees, people who have been forced to go across borders. For example, in 1945, at the close of the Second World War, 12 million, just as an example, 12 million ethnic Germans, that's people who are originally from Germany or can trace their roots there, but didn't live in Germany. 12 million of them, in places like Russia and Poland, were displaced and had no home to go to and couldn't go back to their native Germany because it was a broken country. And so there was 12 million of these ethnic Germans needing a new home, and apparently as a continent we solved and helped many people's home problem or homelessness problem. In the 1970s, when the UK took in thousands of the Asian populations of Kenya and Uganda because of the crises in those countries, as I said, the UK was involved in that. In 1989, similarly, when ethnic Albanians fled Kosovo, the UK was involved. So it's not the first time that we've seen such a crisis, but this current crisis is probably the first time that we've seen so many come from outside of Europe into Europe's relative safety. And the problem, in most cases historically, is a combination of poor government and conflict. You see that time and time again. If there's conflict and then poor government, then there's a refugee crisis close behind it. Because we're in a broken world, we will keep seeing this. Jesus said there will be wars and rumours of wars, increasingly so towards the end times. Well, then I would argue with that there will always be the humanitarian crises that come along with it. We're seeing that again and again. In the last 100 years we've seen that, and this is no different. This is no different from the end of the Second World War. They just happen to all be European refugees that we were needing to find homes for. In Syria, in particular, the more recent history is such that with the succession of father-to-son leadership and the instability over the last decade or more, we've ended up with a situation in 2013 or 14 where people started to flee in alarmingly increased numbers. And as things stand, in 2015, last year, the numbers are as follows, and the screen will display some statistics for you. This is, in 2015, just not 2016, but 2015, first-time applications in thousands. So all these numbers you've got to times by 1,000. These are the top 10, for want of a better phrase, top 10 origins of people applying for asylum within the EU. So they've managed to get into Europe in the most dangerous ways often, and we'll come back to that in a moment. And you'll see Syria is top of the list. Until recent years it was Afghanistan top of the list. Syria has not just overtaken them, but dwarfed them. Syria, well over 350,000 applications for asylum in the EU just in 2015 alone. Afghanistan, roughly 175,000, and then Iraq, just over 100,000, and then we got Kosovo and all these other nations. So there are refugees coming from other countries still. It isn't just Syria, but Syria is a massive part of this crisis. Overall, 1.3 million people claimed asylum in Europe in 2015. If these numbers added on to the other numbers of smaller nations, as it were, smaller numbers, altogether it adds up to 1.3 million people who claimed asylum in Europe in 2015. That's compared with 2013, 431,000, and 2014, 627,000. So we've gone up from 431 to 627 to 1.3 million. Nearly doubling, or at least in the last 2 years, so 2014 to 15, it doubled from 627 to 1.3 million. 627,000 to 1.3 million. The numbers are staggering. The numbers are staggering. And for them, first of all, that many people are in that situation is staggering. Before we start worrying about us. The numbers are staggering for them. Now, who is taking them in? And how is that all working out? It is important that we just go here, but we're only going to go here briefly. So the next chart on the screen just gives you that. This is asylum applications per 100,000 local population, if you go back there. So this is, sadly, it's just missing a couple of countries at the top. Not sure why. But at the top, well above Belgium, you've got countries like Hungary. For every 100,000 of their local population in Hungary, they've taken in 1,799. Sweden, 1,667. The reason it's helpful to do it by size of population, as you can understand, is what capacity has a country got to start with, and then what are they doing in response to the crisis, and how many are they taking in per 100,000 that they've got in their country. It's more helpful than just saying the raw figures, because the raw figures are deceptive, because big countries should better cope with more. Okay, so it's just, rather than looking at that at all, we've just gone straight to this. So for every 100,000, Hungary is top of the list. Whether they like it or not, they are top of the list. 1,799. Then you've got countries like Austria with 1,000, Norway 600, Finland 591, Germany 587. So Germany are taking in a lot, raw figures, raw numbers of people, but per 100,000, not as many as some of the others. Sweden and Hungary are top of the list. The EU average is 260 people for every 100,000 in that nation's population. 260 is the average for every 100,000. And the UK isn't bottom of the list, but it's a lot closer to the bottom than it is to the top. 60 people, 60 refugees we're taking in for every 100,000 of our population. So there's some work to be done in terms of the noise we could make about that. So that just gives you a little bit of a brief description of who's taking in what numbers of people. Let me go back to the big numbers for a moment, because I think it's helpful just to talk about proportions. Because 1.3 million claiming asylum in 1 year in Europe sounds an alarmingly large number and feels threatening to our security and our safety and our way of life, or even just our living standards. It can sound alarming, but when you do it proportionately, it isn't that big a number. 1.3 million is less than 0.2% of the 742 million, roughly, population of Europe. The approximate population of Europe is 742 million. 1.3 million next to that, still big, but it's roughly 1 for every 700 people, right? It's 0.175%, to be precise. 0.175% of Europe's population are those who've claimed asylum. It means that less than a quarter of a person, if you put it like this, I like these kind of ways of looking at it, less than a quarter of a person, so sort of shins down, less than a quarter of a person per 100 people. So if a quarter of a person walked in this room, okay, just go with me, there's over 100 of us here. I would like to think that 100 of us here could look after a quarter of a person who's walked in the room. Or if we were a church of 400, could we cope with one person? Finding them a place to live, finding them some food to eat. Well, we've got plenty of food, we've got a food bank. Could we find them a place to live? 400 of us? I think we could. I'd be ashamed if we couldn't. I think you'd agree. It's worth noting that refugees and asylum seekers, so it's those that haven't applied for asylum yet and those that have, in the UK at the moment, equates to less than 0.25%. So in 2015, it was under 160,000 out of 64 million. So this isn't so remember, this is not economic migrants from the EU and all of that kind of scaremongering we've got at the moment to do with the referendum. Just leave that to one side for a moment. Scaremongering's slightly revealing my hand, but whatever, even if you don't call it scaremongering, it's a different issue right now. Okay? People that are here because they're forced to leave their country, refugees and asylum seekers in the UK at the moment, equates to less than 0.25%. Just asylum seekers, so those who have got a chance of being here permanently, is even less than that, because we looked at that already. That was 60 in 100,000, remember? Well, that's 0.06%. I couldn't even tell you how much of a person that is. Not a lot. Maybe a toe. So, not many people in the country at the moment. Before we go further, I want to personalise this a bit more. And the problem with a lot of this is the danger of just definitions and statistics, and we don't get to talk about people. We, in recent years, met a Syrian family, and they had been, I'm not sure how, but they have got, they had a home already in the UK, and they were kind of holidaying, for one of, I don't know why, but they were holidaying in the UK every year. Maybe it was the lovely weather. They were holidaying here every summer, and then one summer they holidayed in the UK and couldn't go back. I'm not sure, because of their ties back here, whether they needed to apply for asylum or not. I never found out. But they are now permanently here, to the point where for the first few months the children were having to learn English because they'd never really bothered. They were only ever here on holiday. You know, it's like us, or me, when I go to Spain. I never try very hard. They had to suddenly learn English because they were going to need to be educated in this language. Suddenly the whole thing had changed. And we got to know this family a little bit, not too much, but a little bit, and lovely family from that part of the world. And when I try and think about these boats that are coming across the Mediterranean from countries like Syria, I don't really want to imagine that could have been them. But it really could have been. Had they not already had some ties in Europe. They could have been... I can't imagine, but at the same time, I need to try and imagine that it could have been them doing that incredibly dangerous, taking that incredibly dangerous voyage across the Mediterranean. I mention it because if you haven't got that kind of story, then take mine. Because that's who we're talking about. Actual people, actual human beings that didn't really want to move, didn't really want to leave, but were forced to. And it ends up being a lot of the time the routes that they end up taking. Just to mention that, the majority of people that come to Europe from countries like Syria has included this sea journey in these sometimes flimsy boats or dinghies, risking their lives, paying thousands sometimes to do that, risking their lives, and we've seen the images, we've heard the stories. It's frightening what people have gone through. We've seen the pictures of washed up bodies, and you don't do that unless you really have to. You don't do that unless the other alternatives are worse. I don't think. I mean, maybe I'm being a bit naive, but I don't think so. I don't think you do that. So very quickly, the two different responses, just two different extremes that we've got in probably in our society and most societies to any sort of crisis like this. There are two extreme reactions before we get to the Bible kind of view on it. The two reactions are, first of all, a national protectionism over here to protect our country and its way of life, etc. And then over here you've got human rights. To start with, position A, as it were, national protection, a kind of nationalist position. We might feel over here that we want to help. I'm just outlining some of the reactions that are out there. We might feel that we want to help refugees, but it needs to be at a low cost to us as a host nation. It mustn't really hurt us too much. And in this position, probably borders are there for a reason, and that is to keep people out. And there would be, in this extreme, there would be a high expectation on people who do come into our country needing to fit in with our way of life. They need to share British values, for example. That would be this kind of position A extreme. Now, most people are not in one camp or the other fully. There's a kind of, this is a spectrum, but I'm just giving you the two extremes. Over here, the needs of people come first. Human rights are paramount. They're more important than nations and nations' rights. They're more important than even my nation's protection. Some people should be kept out, but on the whole, let's help as many people as we can. And when they get here, they should be allowed to be themselves, because we're so into human rights that we can't force anyone to behave a certain way, so they can just be themselves when they get here. Country versus individual. And I would say these are the two main issues involved, the two main tensions involved whenever you enter into a debate about this, and it will determine which newspaper people are reading, and it will be, you'll see these two extremes and variations in between. Just quickly, one question might be, well, Keith, surely the way to solve this whole crisis is to sort out the root problem. I kind of went there earlier. There's always going to be a root problem. You're always going to have wars and rumours of wars. We've then got to deal with what happens afterwards. And to say, actually, let's just go and sort out Syria, well, have a read as to what's going on in Syria. There isn't just a couple of factions involved. There isn't just the government and the rebels. There's all kinds of complicated countries are getting involved and making it worse, it seems. It's just a mess, an absolute mess. You've got IS, which is a third kind of competing factor in the whole problem there. So yeah, you're right. If we could solve Syria, we would solve the refugee crisis. But all the best working that one out. Thirdly, and very lastly, we're going to look at a biblical response. I just want to list some Old Testament verses to begin with, and then we'll move into the New Testament. This is going to be a whistle-stop tour of God's heart for refugees. Okay? Exodus 12, verse 49. This should appear on the screen. The same law applies to both to the native born and to the foreigner residing among you. Exodus 22, 21. Do not ill-treat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Leviticus 19, 9 and 10. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. If you know the book of Ruth, that is applied beautifully, and we see the unravelling story of Ruth as Boaz does what he's told from Leviticus 19, and looks after her, the other people that were foreigners, and she just happened to be one of them, and then the romantic story comes from that. Leviticus 19, 33 and 34. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not ill-treat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. And to quell any doubts, love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt, full stop. I am the Lord your God. All right then. Deuteronomy 10, verses 17 and 19. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. Keep getting that repeated phrase, that they were once foreigners themselves. We'll come back to it, but we were once foreigners to God. You have to stubbornly close your ears and your eyes to not recognise a theme and a pattern of care, not only to the internal vulnerable, the widow and the orphan, who were born in Israel, but also the traveller, the foreigner, those who found themselves in Israel. And we don't get any distinction. Have you noticed? There's no distinction between economic migrant and refugee. It's not important, it would seem. The assumption is they're going to need help because they've come here with nothing or very little. We simply hear over and over again throughout the Old Testament this theme of God's biased heart towards the vulnerable. And I don't mean that in a negative bias. We say the word bias, we mean it negatively. He has a strong leaning towards the vulnerable, and we see it time and time again. How does the biblical theme concerning the foreigner entering the nation of Israel impact nations of the world today? How does that, in a liberal democracy like the UK, how does that apply? It was a theocracy. It was a God-governed country of Israel. It was a nation-state of Israel. How does that then apply to us today? We'll come back to it. How does the teaching of Jesus, the teaching of the New Testament, impact on the heart that we see in the Old Testament? Let's go there first of all. Because do we shrink the application of the Old Testament and the New and all that Jesus says that we'll see in a moment? Do we shrink that to just apply it to us as a church, that we should be those that are caring and looking out for people? Or is there something more we should be saying to governments of nations like ours? What's the right way of applying all of this? Do we expand the application to include modern nations who may or may not want to follow the Bible's teaching? How do we go about all of this? Who did Jesus mean, moving into what he was talking about, who did Jesus mean in Matthew 25:40 when he says, if you remember this passage, Jesus talks about the fact that we fed him, we clothed him, we visited him in prison. Do you remember that passage? Well, because Jesus says, when you fed me, when you clothed me, when you visited me in prison, and the kind of reply is, well, when did we do that? He says, when you did it to the least of these, when you did it to the vulnerable, when you fed them, when you clothed them, you were doing it for me. Who are the least of these that Jesus is talking about? Is it just those who live on our road and always have done? Or at least have done for a few years? Is it just those that look like us and sound like us? Is it just those that speak our language? Or at least speak it a little bit? Better than my Spanish? Is it just those people? Matthew 28, which is just 3 chapters after Matthew 25, in case you wondered, Jesus is talking about the nations. Go and make disciples of all nations. I don't think, again, he was trying to categorise that we should only be feeding the poor and the vulnerable and visiting them in prison and looking out for them if they look like us and if they are from our nation originally. We're under a new world order since Jesus rose again and ascended and sent his Spirit. The whole world has always been God's oyster, but it's kind of even more so now. Obviously, it's always been his because he created it, but there's a sense in which the church, the kingdom, is to impact nations in a way that it never has done before. And it's always been in God's heart. The nations have always been in God's heart. We see it right back in the story of Abraham, that he would be a father of nations, Genesis 17. And these laws that we see in the Old Testament, these Levitical laws about not gleaning to the edge of your field, and etc., they may not be laws that we can apply in great detail, but the heart behind them has not changed. I don't think it's shrunk. I think the heart behind them has only increased. So if we see a heart for the poor and the vulnerable and the foreigner and the refugee in the Old Testament, I don't think we can say, oh, well, it's Old Testament, and we can leave it and shrink it a bit and make life a bit easier for us. I don't think we get to do that with the Bible. If anything, it's just a load more. If there was a heart of God for the vulnerable in the Old Testament, it's just more of the same, and if not more, in the New. More inclusive, not less. Don't you feel that in the New Testament? Everything just gets more inclusive, not less. It's not just about Israel's responsibility, but the whole world is ours to influence with God's heart for the vulnerable. And then you throw into the mix a number of other things I'm just going to kind of pepper you with right now. We see refugees throughout the Bible. You've ever seen Krish Kandiah's video on the refugee crisis? He does the same. I'm just copying him. He lists them. Abraham, these are all refugees at some point or other in the Bible. Abraham, Sarah, Lot, Hagar, Ishmael, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, Esau, Joseph and his family. Then Moses takes Israel into the wilderness. Naomi, Ruth, David, Esther, Mordecai, Jeremiah. And then we move into the New Testament. Philip, Peter, Aquila, Priscilla, the whole early church was scattered. Even Jesus, Mary and Joseph had to hide in Egypt. We see refugees, and we see God looking after refugees throughout the Bible. In Ruth, as I mentioned earlier, we see that Levitical law as a backdrop. We see something of the heart of God in Boaz as he's the kinsman redeemer, the one of the family that would come along and look after her. We see God's concern for the foreigner again there in the book of Ruth. It's the same concern that we then see repeated, I would argue, in John 4 as Jesus talks to the foreign woman. She was a Samaritan, but she couldn't have been more foreign. They were like the enemies of Israel. They once upon a time were the same nation, but they were now enemies. And he's talking to the woman at the well. Not only should he not be talking to a woman in public, but he shouldn't be talking to a Samaritan ever. And he does it. I see the same heart of God for the foreigner as Jesus talks to this woman in John 4. Not only that, she had all kinds of issues going on. There was all kinds of reasons why Jesus shouldn't have been talking to her or been associated with her. He seems to be taking up this theme of all the nations that begins right back in the beginning of the Bible with Abraham and his call. And we see it throughout the laws of the Old Testament that we've seen. And then we see it again in Revelation, all the nations before God. We see it in places like Ephesians 2. If you want to bring Paul into it for a moment. Paul finally nails the coffin lid shut of racist tension or racism and racial tension, if there is to be any anywhere. He nails that coffin shut when he says in Ephesians 2 that in Jesus Christ there is to be no Jew, no Gentile, no German, no English, no Polish, no Nigerian, no Chinese. There is to be no dividing, but I mean obviously we are from different nations, that's okay, but there is to be no dividing barrier between these nations anymore. He says that in Ephesians 2. It's like, if you're in any doubt, read Ephesians 2. Oh, okay. So where I'm from doesn't... No. If they're a Christian and they're from Mongolia or Spain or even America, that's more important than the national identities that we may or may not hold dear. We're all one person in Christ, he says. We're made one new person in Christ. The Bible, I would argue, is less about human rights of a person and more about human value, the value of a person. Which I think then, if you were to talk about these two extremes, I think the Bible is, I would argue, nearer this end, but it's not classically down this end. Because human value is more important than human rights. A high view in the Bible is of relationships in society. And the people living in ghettos and camps in places like Calais, I would argue, do not reflect the Bible's high view of human value and care and the heart on social relationships that we see for society in the Bible. And then I mentioned it already, but not only were all these people that I've listed refugees, we were refugees. On two levels we were refugees. Number one, we were not just estranged and foreign to God, we were his enemies. You know, we really did want to come to that, we did really want to come to that nation and do it harm. We wanted to hurt God. We were his enemies, it says. And he drew us close. We were ill-deserving of his love and his grace, and he drew us close. We were refugees and he drew us close. Jesus entered our world and we esteemed him not. He became a refugee for us. Not just when he had to move to Egypt with his family, but he became a refugee the minute they decided to go through with the plan of salvation and rescue for us as a human race. The minute Jesus was born in a stable, he was a refugee in a foreign world. It was his own created planet, but we made it foreign to him. On a second level, we now as Christians, this is really important and we forget it so easily. Even now as Christians, we're foreigners. In Peter says we're aliens. I don't know if you've ever read that. He says we're aliens. We're on another planet. Our home isn't here. Which is why the whole nationalism thing is completely inappropriate for Christians. Or at least very limited. I get excited about England playing football, but that's about the limit in many ways. Getting a bit excited about a sporting event. The minute it becomes any kind of more of a rivalry than that, I think we're in dangerous territory when we are already aliens from another planet or from heaven, as it were. This isn't home. England isn't my fatherland or motherland, whatever you want to describe it. Heaven is. So I will put the care of people wherever they are from before the protection of my country that I come from, because this country, or at least my status in this country, is temporary. In fact, this nation itself is temporary. It's a revolutionary thing to say, but it's true. There will one day be a new heavens and a new earth, the Bible says. Lastly, the Bible displays God's sovereignty through such crises that we are seeing or have seen throughout history. The early church was scattered. They were refugees because of persecution, because of the name of Jesus. God used that to take the gospel to the whole world. And the spread of the gospel, which God can do through any and all world events, is a fascinating and important perspective that we must have on this whole crisis. A guy called David Crabb put it like this: Syria has over 20 million Muslims in 18 unreached people groups. You know the whole thing of reaching unreached people groups? Christian missionaries have spent years praying, strategizing and risking everything to go to these people. Now, whether you like this or not, it's kind of, if God is sovereign, this is what's happening. Now, God is bringing them here. After raising tens of thousands of dollars, undergoing extensive training, leaving everything familiar, and going through the grueling process of learning a foreign language, only then could a missionary experience the breakthrough of having a deep conversation with someone like our Syrian friends who we got to know in recent years. God's making the whole world a lot smaller and bringing everybody into contact with each other. And it's not just the internet. It's through these wars and rumours of wars, which Jesus said we will have. And it's not good. It's not right. And there's evil behind it. But God can use that evil even to spread the gospel. What can we do as a church and as individuals? How can we live out this heart of God, not only for the vulnerable within our walls, but for the vulnerable outside of our walls? In this case, the refugees, the thousands of them. The things we can do include the following. And this won't be a conclusive list, but here are some suggestions on things we can do as Christians and as a church. We can not give in to the fear-mongering that there is, which says that every refugee has got a bomb in their bag. We can not give in to the mild or strong anti-foreigner talk that there will be around. We can recognise that governments have tough decisions to make, balancing human value and national interest. We need to be aware of that and real, not do you know what I mean? Not unhelpful. Be aware of the fact that it is a balancing act. We need to reflect God's heart in our conversations. We need to reflect God's heart as we tweet and Facebook and whatever things I'm completely out of touch with now. All the social media. We need to reflect God's heart as we voice concerns to our local and national governments. We need to let it affect the way that we talk. We can make more of a noise than we currently are. And lastly, we can look for ways in which we can be there for our new neighbours when they arrive and they don't know much English and they haven't got much food and they don't own many clothes and they're feeling vulnerable and they're feeling scared. We can be ready. And we are getting ready. There are things we're doing corporately, but all of us need to have that heart. We need to be ready to give financially and to receive these people lovingly and pray for them these new neighbours, these people like Ruth who need care. And there's a thing about working with vulnerable people that I think is always true. It will cost you something. And that's okay. We can't do it on a freebie. Oh, I've got a real heart for the poor. How much have you given to any of it? Oh, well, I've got a Facebook page. It's all about it. What have you done? Yeah, I keep linking all these different sites that are amazing. What have you done? What have you given? We can even be there to foster unaccompanied children that we've already heard about. What must it be to have to send your child abroad via a dinghy? How bad must it have got for you to have to do that? We can be there for those children that have turned up without any parents. And then we need to be praying. Tonight we've got a prayer meeting, 7 o'clock at Mocha Parade. It wasn't mentioned earlier, but I'd love to see as many of you there as can be there. 7 o'clock, Mocha Parade. We're going to worship, we're going to pray together, and I'd love us to pray into this whole crisis. We can pray for the well-being of these people as they arrive. We can pray that peace would enter countries like Syria. We can pray into all of it. We can pray more than we could ask or imagine. That's what the Bible says we can do. We can pray. And we can look to be, ultimately, the Boaz. We can look to be Jesus for these people. So if the band would like to come up, we're just running slightly over time, but it's important that we bring this to God. As we worship right now, the offering buckets and will go around. If you're a guest, we're not after your money, please don't worry about that, but we would love to hear from you. So as Tina mentioned earlier, the Connect cards are in your drinks holders. You can fill them out as we're worshipping together right now, and if there's anything you want to find out about them, please, that's the place to write it down and put it in the bucket as they go around. As we worship, some of you might need to say, sorry, God, I've had a wrong heart in all of this. Some of you might have to repent, which means to turn away from some bad attitudes or bad heart in all this, or a hardness of heart. Maybe an indifference. You know, we're talking about millions of people, and sometimes we can be indifferent. God, melt my heart and unblock my tear ducts when I'm watching the news. Some of us need to ask God for soft hearts. All of us can pray. Tonight we'll do that. But let's bring ourselves to God in worship and ask Him to highlight anything in our hearts that we think needs addressing. Like I said, tonight it's going to be an important opportunity for us to pray for our government, to pray for the voice of the church, to pray for peace in countries like Syria, and to pray for relief and care for those that are arriving in for refugees. Could we stand together, please? As Hannah and the band lead us.